Gonna go ahead and ask everybody to come on in, find your seat as Ted's coming up here. Also, just a couple of notes. When it comes to a question and answer session, if you would hold up your hand and wait for the microphone so that the online audience can hear your question as well, we would greatly appreciate that because this is being broadcast online as well as recorded, so we'd like for everybody to be able to hear the question as well as the answer as much as we love Jeopardy. It's helpful to have both. And obviously the question and answer sessions will be covered by Ted. We're going to have 2 more sessions, after which we will close for the evening. And I thank everybody for attending. And I think he is wrapping up his last sale right now and coming up. So without much further ado, I'm just going to leave this area blank for him to go ahead and start. What's that? Yeah. Let's go ahead and give him applause.
So we've worked through the first 2 questions apologetically that have to be true. In order for Jesus to be the Messiah, truth has to exist, and God has to exist. Miracles have to be possible. Now again, I'm just taking, for the sake of apologetic argument, miracles have to be possible. If there's no miracles, there's no Jesus, he can't be the Messiah. If there's no God, Jesus can't be God, because that's the claim. That's what he claimed. He claimed to be God in the flesh before Abraham was. What does he say? I am. He literally equated himself with the God of the Old Testament. So eventually we end up with the New Testament, with the Bible and the stories in the Scripture. Generally speaking, the question we want to really look at now is the stories in the Bible, are they fact or fiction? Or are they just made up? And they're all recorded in the pages of the New Testament, the Old Testament, and they are really amazing stories. The question is, can we trust them? How do we know? Well, before our last session, I gave you a little test. We talked about primary sources, and historians and archaeologists, we study primary sources. So does anybody remember what the primary sources were? There are 3 of them. The first one is what? Eyewitnesses, historical records, archaeological evidence. God, you guys are awesome. Rabbi Jeff, you did a great job. You're doing a great job here, brother. It's like all that great wisdom. So you may or may not know, and maybe you have never approached this, but there is something going around on the internet today called the Spider-Man fallacy. Some of you may or may not have seen this. Spider-Man, of course, is a cool superhero. But the Spider-Man fallacy is really popular among internet atheists today. They like to talk about, well, especially on my Epic Archaeology Facebook page, we'll post all kinds of different artifacts that show the Bible is actually historically accurate, and there will always be somebody that pops up in the comment thread that says, oh yeah, well that's just like the Spider-Man comic book records New York City, but nobody believes that Spider-Man really existed, and it's called the Spider-Man fallacy. So therefore, the implication is the Spider-Man comic book is a fake book, and it can talk about real things, and it's actually not true. You see the thing there? That's the fallacy. So this is it. This is in the website gotquestions.org. This is the Spider-Man fallacy, sort of laid out in its basic format. Basically, it says in the future, archaeologists find an old Spider-Man comic book, and within those comics are certain facts that are true, such as New York being an actual city. Based on that historical evidence, the archaeologists wrongly conclude that Spider-Man must have actually existed too. Now, again, this is a fallacy. A fallacy is an error in logic. There are many, and actually I wrote a response to this on Epic Archaeology. If you go to my website, epicarchaeology.org, and you click on blog, the latest blog that I wrote was answering the Spider-Man fallacy. And really, it actually commits several fallacies. But we are called as believers in 1 Peter 3:15. Some of you know this verse by heart. Peter says, the Apostle Peter says, always be ready to give an answer for the reason, the hope that is within you, but do this with gentleness and respect. So when people ask you, why do you believe this stuff? We should be able to know how to give an answer. And the word, be ready to give an answer, is the Greek word apologia. That's where we get the word apologetics. So apologetics comes from the word answer. But the last part is just as important, I think, and that gentleness and truth. We need to always keep in mind, whenever we're talking to people, to maintain a calm demeanor, to be winsome, to be loving, to be kind. I know it's hard to do because I have been involved in debates, trust me. And in my younger career, when I was a young professor and a young Christian starting out studying apologetics, I was gung-ho. I was ready to show those atheists how dumb they are, you know. And but that's not how you do apologetics, not biblically. Biblically, we're told to do it with gentleness and respect. And so try to do that when you're engaging with people who need to know the Savior. This is, of course, a very important passage. He goes on to say, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good than should be God's will than doing evil. So always be ready to give an answer. So let's go back to our three primary sources: eyewitnesses, historical records, and archaeological evidence. Let's say a couple other things about historical records. One of the other things that we want as historians and archaeologists is not only do we want eyewitnesses if we can get them, we want, if they're not alive, what we want are historical records that have been written by an eyewitness. Someone mentioned maybe their grandparents were in a war or whatever. We want that person to write their diary, and if we get that would be great. So we want what's called early attestation, multiple attestation, and enemy attestation. So multiple attestation is not just one eyewitness, but what if we have a lot of eyewitnesses? What if we have multiple eyewitnesses saying the exact same thing? That's a pretty strong case that this historical record is pretty accurate. And then we have enemy attestation. We have someone who is not necessarily in agreement with what's being reported, but they are saying essentially the same thing. They're basically saying the same thing. So, and then the archaeological evidence, and it sort of forms a circle here, because if we can see the relationship, and really what I'm interested in as an archaeologist is I'm interested in the connection between the historical record and the archaeological evidence. I want to know, does the archaeological evidence support or deny the supposed eyewitness historical records? Now, any book can claim to be a historical record, but where at the end of the day, where do we find it? Where do we go look it up? So, for instance, one of my favorite books besides Spider-Man, I like Spider-Man. It's not my favorite comic book hero. My favorite comic book hero is Indiana Jones, but Spider-Man's really cool. But I also love the book series, The Lord of the Rings, written by J.R.R. Tolkien. And Tolkien, of course, wrote this incredible 3-volume story about this story of a hobbit named Bilbo Baggins and Frodo Baggins. And Frodo goes on this journey to destroy this ring in the city of Mordor, in the Mount Doom, and not a city, but it's in a Mount Doom. It's this volcano, and he goes to all these different places. He goes to Helm's Deep. He goes to all these different areas, the area of Rohan, and all these places that Tolkien makes up. Here's the question I have for those who want to use the Spider-Man fallacy. Show me where to go dig up Rohan. Where do I stick my shovel in? What dirt do I go find Lothlorien or Rivendell? Is it in some forest in New Zealand? It's in New Zealand. That's why we haven't found it yet. It's in New Zealand. It's in Chicago. That's right. No, that's Hoth. That's in Star Wars. That's Hoth. Some of you will catch that. Hoth is the ice planet, by the way. Anyway, so I'll give you a story about my own life. My grandfather. So as a kid growing up, I remember actually my grandparents lived in southern Arkansas. Please don't hold that against me. But I would go down there, and we would normally go. There was about a 10-year period in which my mom and my dad worked a lot, so it would sometimes just be me and my sister, my mom, and we'd drive down to see my grandparents in Arkansas. And my grandfather, he had this really, really great wood-burning fireplace, not a wood-burning stove, but an actual wood fireplace. And he just enjoyed chopping wood. And he would always show me his wood. And I was like, thank you, Grandpa, that's nice wood you got, And I was like, okay. But he always made these great fires in the fireplace. And it just brings back memories to this day. I remember the smell of the smoke in the fireplace, and it was like cold, and we would back up to the fireplace, and we'd have a hot tea or hot cocoa. And my grandfather would tell stories about being in the war. He would start getting reflective and start talking about the war and crossing the English Channel and England and the Germans and the cold water of the English Channel. And I'd never connected with me. I'm like, okay, well, whatever. I didn't know. I was 9 years old, 7 years old. Turns out my grandfather was in D-Day, June 6, 1944. He was there. He drove a landing barge on D-Day, a landing barge. Have you ever seen the movie Saving Private Ryan? Seen that movie? You know the scene where Tom Hanks' character is in the boat, and the waves are crashing over, and the gate drops down, and the Germans. My grandfather drove that boat, that kind of boat. Third wave, Omaha Beach. My grandfather saw it. He was an eyewitness to D-Day. So years ago when he passed away, my grandmother gave me something very precious. I've never seen these before until after he passed away. My grandfather, when he was in his 20s in the Navy in 1944, this is a black and white photograph of my grandfather from basically the Navy manual that they gave him on the ship going over to England. And on the back of these black and white photographs, he had writing on them. And this is my grandfather actually standing in front of the U.S. Naval Headquarters in England in 1943. And there is a photograph of the headquarters. I since learned that this was the Royal Naval College of the British Navy in England. They made it in the U.S. headquarters. And this is a picture of him in training, when he was actually in training to drive the Higgins boat. He's standing on the very top left-hand corner. There's a guy on the front row with a knife in his teeth. But these are all guys that are going to be driving in the this is actually a photograph of the boats that they are painting to go to the D-Day landings. And as they crossed the English Channel, his unit apparently captured a German torpedo boat. And this was a sailor that was captured by my grandfather's unit. He happened to take his camera out and take a picture of this German sailor. And the only reason to know this is because it was on the back of the picture. It said, captured German sailor, E-boat, 1944. So, amazing. My grandfather is an eyewitness. What is the second source of history? Historical records, writing. So my grandfather is writing historical records. Not only that, but in the book, in these inserts in the book, there are fold-outs in this Navy Jackets, Blue Jackets manual, and there's writing on these, and I have to get close to see it. One of them, he's saying here, he's convalescing March 28, 1944 in Teignmouth, England, still convalescing, heating some water for Bowley to wash with. Boat is on Marine Railway, being painted CC, underlined twice. And Sunday, May 27th, 2 a.m., got pretty D-A-M, hot. It got pretty darn hot. In the harbor, raids are hell. What he's talking about is the German Luftwaffe was bombing England before the war. And he's an eyewitness. So again, when we talk about eyewitnesses, what else do we want with historical sources? Remember, we talked about early sources, multiple sources, and enemy sources. The enemy saying the same thing. And so, but this is the most interesting thing of all. This one is actually found in the machine gun section of his manual, and this is actually where it actually states. I have to read up close to read it, but basically, on the writing there, it's an old fountain pen, June 5, 2 a.m. until June 6, 6:33 a.m. You know the dates, June 6. June 6, 28 of the most miserable hours I ever spent. We made the trip from Portland, England to France Beach in our 50-foot barges. Sea was rough as could be, wet and cold entire trip, 1944, underlined 3 times. So there's my grandfather writing about D-Day, June 6, 1944. He's there. He's an eyewitness. So what is the other evidence? Now, this is not my grandfather's photograph. This is from the U.S. Library of Congress. So just to show you that it wasn't just my grandfather writing about this. There were thousands of other sailors and soldiers, Army, Canada, America, the Allies, the French, the British, writing about the same thing. And so this is actually from the Library of Congress. So when they finally did land on D-Day, they had all of these ships, all these barges, all the tanks, and all the things. And you can now go to Normandy, and you can actually visit. The German positions are still there, the concrete reinforced machine gun positions. So you have the eyewitness, my grandfather, the historical evidence, his diary, and not just my grandfather, but you've got multiple other sources from other nations. And then you have the archaeological evidence. Not only do you have the concrete positions, you also have thousands and thousands of dead sailors and soldiers buried on the slopes of Normandy that can be dated to the 1940s, showing us that this. Now, here's a question. I want to pose to you a theoretical question. Now, it's not a trick question, and just be brutally honest in your answer. Do you think there will ever come a time that people will deny World War II ever happened? That will be doubted? Yes, there was unanimous. Like, yes, there will be people who denied that World War II happened. Absolutely. Are there people who deny the Holocaust? Yes. Are there people today who have forgotten 9/11? Yes. Are there people who have forgotten what happened on October 7th? That happened just not even a year ago. Yes. And it's willing ignorance. But the evidence is there. The evidence is there. And we need to learn this evidence. So, this is one of the earliest fragments we have of the New Testament. The New Testament claims to be written by eyewitnesses, does it not? Do the writers of the New Testament say, we were eyewitnesses. We saw him rise from the dead. We saw him with our own eyes. We saw his pierced hands and his pierced feet. And so one of the earliest historical sources that we have is something called P52. It's in the John Rylands Library in Manchester, England. And interestingly enough, this fragment, which is still considered to be one of the earliest fragments, now the date here, this is one of the dates. There are different dates that scholars have, paleographers have, of the John Rylands fragment. But this is in the 2nd century A.D., 117 to 138. And it contains, it's actually one fragment, so on the left-hand side is what they call the front or the recto, and the verso is on the back. Flip it over, so it's written on front and back, and it's actually John 18. John 18 essentially is the episode where Jesus has this conversation with Pontius Pilate, and they're asking, what is truth? What is truth? Everyone on the truth listens to my voice and hears my voice. But this is one of the earliest fragments that we have of the New Testament. So we have incredibly early eyewitness sources. Another early document that we have is called P1. This is from a cache of papyri that was discovered in a place in Egypt by Grenfell and Hunt. And this is called the Oxyrhynchus papyri. This is it dates to around 250 A.D. It's in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 1, 9 through 12, 13, and then 14 through 20. So very, very early sources. Now, again, are we back all the way at the, do we have really, really early sources? Well, all the arrows indicate that all the primary sources for the historical records indicate that all these sources are very, very early. So here are the number of manuscripts that we have today. Total number of New Testament Greek manuscripts as it stands today is about 5,800. More close today, actually, to 6,000. Non-Greek manuscripts, which is Armenian and Latin, number to around 18 to 20,000, bringing the total number of New Testament manuscripts up to 23,900. And there are two organizations today that are on the forefront of actually counting and keeping tally of how many New Testament manuscripts are being discovered. And one is in Germany. It's called the Institute for the New Testament, the Institute for the New Testament Textual Research in Munster, Germany. And the other one is called the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. You can actually go to this today and look it up. So if you want to jot it down, it's csntm.org. This was actually founded by a professor of Greek New Testament, Dr. Daniel Wallace at Dallas Theological Seminary. Dr. Wallace founded this. Goodness, it's been over 10 years ago now. I've met Dan a couple of times in Dallas, actually, and I was able to actually see some actual new manuscripts being translated as they were being translated. But you can actually search the database on this, and they are discovering. Now, let me tell you about a little bit about CSNTM and why this figures into apologetics and how this figures into making the case for the early sources of the New Testament. So initially, they started it because they were concerned that many of the libraries in Europe and also in the Middle East contain ancient biblical manuscripts. So they started the Institute to take his doctoral students to go and digitally photograph these libraries that contain ancient biblical manuscripts. Well, that was done over 15 years ago, and what they have discovered as they've been digitally archiving all these ancient manuscripts from these monasteries in Europe and France and England and Germany. They've also been documenting, get this, the oldest monastery in the world in Israel in the Sinai Peninsula, St. Catherine's Monastery, which is a Greek Orthodox monastery that contains countless biblical manuscripts. Well, as it turns out, there are manuscripts they didn't even know existed. And they're being discovered every day. You are now living in an age in which we are discovering new manuscripts that were hitherto unknown by scholars. And it is absolutely remarkable. And so you can actually go on their website and follow them. You support their ministry, does great work. And you can actually study these manuscripts up close. I actually typed in one manuscript, and it has several photographs. If you know how to read Greek, you can actually zoom in on this. It'll give you a thumbnail. It's all free. This one is from the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, Ireland, an ancient biblical manuscript. So Dan Wallace says this: ours is not a lack of evidence, but an embarrassment of riches in biblical manuscripts. An embarrassment of riches. We have today, when it comes to New Testament manuscripts, we have very, very early manuscripts, and we have reliable manuscripts. We say, well, how do we know they are reliable? Well, let me go back up. I don't have this on a slide, but let me say this. I have it on another slide. I thought it was in this presentation, but it's not. But as Dan Wallace goes on to say in one of his books he wrote on this, that the New Testament early church fathers. Now, let's talk about, again, when it comes to eyewitnesses, we want early eyewitnesses. We want people who lived during the time of Jesus, not someone who's making it up. And so we believe that the biblical manuscripts were written during the time of the apostles. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote them in the original writing. They were the original authors of these Gospels. So we believe those existed. Those are the autographa. But what we have are copies. What they've done, they were spread out and sent to other churches, and copies were made of these early Gospels. So what we have are these early copies that were made. Well, how do we know these copies, there were not errors in these copies? Well, it's not on the slide, but I'll say this. It's something that Dan Wallace has said in his lectures, and also in his book he says this as well. The early church fathers, this is, okay, so you have the Apostle Peter, the Apostle Paul, and we know, we have their writings, we have them in the New Testament, we have Paul's epistles, and we have Peter, of course, wrote. In nowhere in the New Testament, especially in the later epistles, do any of the New Testament writers mention a very major event that happened in the life of Jerusalem. And what was that? In 70 A.D., the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So that means that even Peter and Paul, when they were imprisoned in Rome, you would have known that they would have got word that the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem. They don't write about it because it had not yet happened, which means that the writings of Peter and Paul were written before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So they are pre-70 A.D. Now follow my reasoning here. So they are martyred, and then after Peter and Paul, you have men like Ignatius and Polycarp. These are the men that knew the apostles. They are quoting the New Testament thousands of times. In fact, Dan Wallace says you could reconstruct the New Testament thousands of times over just by the quotations from the early church fathers. No one disputes the dates of the early church fathers like Ignatius and Polycarp. No one disputes them. But they're referring to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in Paul's letter or Peter's letter. They're quoting Peter and Paul, and the quotes that they have are exactly what we have. So you can reconstruct the early church from the early church fathers, the New Testament, thousands of times over. So we mentioned early attestation, multiple attestation. What is the claim? What is the major claim? Now, I'm not yet talking about every story in the Bible. Let's just talk about the resurrection. The resurrection is that there was a Jewish rabbi that lived in the Roman Empire, in the Roman city of Jerusalem. It was Roman occupied, Jerusalem, who was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and he rose from the dead, or his disciples claim he rose from the dead. Now, as this news filters down into Roman sources, are they going to believe Jesus is the Messiah? No, maybe not necessarily, but they're going to record the claim that his disciples were making. Well, look at what Josephus says. Josephus was actually an eyewitness to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 A.D. He was actually there. And this is what Josephus said about Christ. Historical facts about Jesus that we can get just from Josephus. Jesus was known as a wise and virtuous man. Jesus had many disciples, both Jews and Gentiles. Pilate condemned Jesus to die. He was executed by crucifixion. Aren't these all things the New Testament affirms? Every single one of them are. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. He was died by crucifixion. His disciples reported that he rose from the dead. He appeared to them the third day after his crucifixion. His disciples continued to proclaim his teaching. He was perhaps predicted by the Old Testament prophets. His brother's name was James. Now, why would Josephus include all this information if these were not things that he could have verified? He was actually writing for the emperor Vespasian and Titus. Vespasian was the father, Titus was the son. These are the two Roman emperors that sacked the temple in Jerusalem. And he would have had access to Pontius Pilate's official records. He would have had access. Pontius Pilate, by the way, was a Roman official. And as a Roman official, you had to do reports. And if you are in Rome and you are traveling around with the Roman generals and all the Roman high elite, you would have had access to all the Roman documents. So Josephus is not just making stuff up. He's recording things that were true. His brother's name was James. He was called Mashiach by some. Some called him the Messiah. This is eyewitness accounts recorded by Josephus. Tacitus also writes about Jesus. Now, again, Tacitus is not a friend to Christianity, but he's writing, again, from Rome about certain things about Jesus. Historian G.F. McClear says, classical history attests that these persons existed at the same time specified and that they bore offices assigned to them, and that the actions ascribed to them are either exactly such as they performed or at least in perfect keeping with their known characters. And so in other words, some of these officials that the New Testament records are also recorded by Tacitus. Tacitus, the Roman historian, records many of these same officials. And what McClear is saying is that we know every single one of these: Augustus, Tiberius, Claudius, Cyrenius or Quirinius, Pontius Pilate, Felix, Festus, Sergius Paulus, and Gallio. By the way, we have evidence for Gallio and Sergius Paulus. Indirect evidence archaeologically that both of these guys existed. And we also, again, these are hostile. We would call, this is from J. Warner Wallace. Some of you guys may know who that is. J. Warner Wallace, former cold case homicide detective who's now turned Christian apologist. He's written some really great books. By the way, that would be a really good Christmas gift to give to your skeptical friends. It's called Cold Case Christianity. He uses detective work. He was a cold case homicide detective in Torrance, California, and used his detective skills to look at the Gospels. And this is his slide, Jim's slide from the hostile eyewitness account. Pliny the Younger, his followers thought he was God. This is what Pliny says. Phlegon predicted the future, he says. He rose after death. These are things that were claimed. Bar Serapion says he was a wise king. The Jews wanted him dead. Tacitus, Thallus, the Babylonian Talmud, Josephus, of course, and Suetonius as well writes all about these. The bottom line is that these are grounded in space and time. We can actually go with a spade and we can actually look at where these happen. Not only where they happen, but when they happen. The Bible tells us that Jesus lived during the time of Pontius Pilate. So where do we go? We go and look at that level and see if the evidence backs it up. And we know exactly that time frame. Roger Young, biblical chronologist, says this. He says the Bible doesn't just contain chronological markers, it abounds in them. This is unlike the sacred writings of most religions. There are 125 chronological markers for the 410 years from the first year of Solomon to the release of Jehoiachin from prison, plus numerous chronological clues of a more general nature. So the Bible gives us exactly when to look for historical events. I'll give you one example, Luke chapter 2. Look at what Luke says. And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed, and this taxing was first made when Quirinius was governing Syria. So all went to be taxed, everyone to his own city. And Joseph also went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth unto Judea, the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be taxed with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child. Does that sound like somebody's making something up? He's giving us exactly when this happened. He's giving us, this is not a once upon a time story. This is here is when it happened. It's when Quirinius was governing Syria. We can actually go check it out. And back in several years ago, this site has been known about for many years, actually, for 2,000 years, but the site's been excavated on and off for probably 30 or 40 years. And Israeli archaeologist Ehud Netzer discovered the coffin of King Herod the Great. King Herod, the same Herod that, basically wanted all the Hebrew children dead. Ehud Netzer in 2007 discovered this at Herodium. He had been looking for it for about a decade. And sadly, Professor Netzer passed away several years ago. He actually, I think, if I remember this correctly, I think he actually slipped and fell at Herodium and died at Herodium, which is where Herod was buried. But Josephus tells us that Herod was buried at Herodium, but they had looked for years. And in fact, I interviewed Jody Magnus, who is a professor of archaeology at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. About 2 years ago, I interviewed Jody on this, and I asked Jody what she thought about it. And she actually wrote an article on it. She wrote an article on Netzer's discovery of King Herod's coffin. What Jody says is this is one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in Israel since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But the reason why it didn't get a lot of traction is because there were some hocus History Channel documentaries talking about they found the tomb of Jesus, and it was all pseudo-archaeology, and it got all the airtime, and it was fake, And the real object that should have gotten more attention was the sarcophagus of Herod the Great. This is a major discovery, and yet we have his coffin. So here we have independent confirmation of King Herod, and you can see it there today in the Jerusalem Museum, in the Archaeological Museum, mentioned in chapter 2. By the way, it was smashed to pieces. Herod had a lot of people who hated him, and probably not too long after he died, somebody broke into the tomb, and they smashed it to pieces, and the body wasn't found. But the fact of the matter is, it's very likely that is the exact spot. But at that same place, archaeologists, actually in 1969 it was excavated, but it wasn't until, I think, 2018 until the ring was deciphered. And it was a signet ring that contained the name of Pontius Pilate. So Pilate, we know, was actually became friends with one of Herod's sons, Herod Antipas, in Luke 23. And it's very likely that Antipas was using Herodium as an administrative center, and this would have meant that Pilate had access to do his official business in Rome at Herodium. So another independent archaeological confirmation. In 1990, archaeologists in Jerusalem discovered the sarcophagus, and not only the sarcophagus, the ossuary, we call it an ossuary actually, of Caiaphas. This is the high priest who presided over the trial of Christ. And you say, well, Ted, how do you know it's the same priest? Because Josephus tells us his full name, Yehoseph bar Caiapha, which is Joseph, Caiaphas, son of Joseph. So we know this is the Caiaphas. In fact, I don't know of any archaeologist who denies this, but inside of the ossuary were the bones of a 60-plus-year-old man that are 2,000 years old. Is this Caiaphas? If it's not, who else could it be? His name was on the coffin. His name was on the sarcophagus. So we have the bones of the man that struck Jesus in the face. Pretty awesome stuff. Pretty amazing. In I believe this was in 1993, 94, at a place called Tel Dan. One of the earliest inscriptions containing the name of David, the house of David, was found in an Aramaic inscription at Tel Dan by Abraham Biram that mentions David. Now, there are some other artifacts that mention David, but this is one that mentions David, and this is significant because at the time, in the early 1990s, there was a theory going around in archaeology called biblical minimalism, in which basically Bible scholars were denying that David even existed, that there even was a King David. Well, there's his name right there. So whenever scholars doubt that someone existed, we find independent archaeological confirmation that, and by the way, all these past discoveries were found by, like, the Caiaphas ossuary, the Pilate ring, except for the tomb or the sarcophagus of Herod the Great, because Netzer was looking for his tomb. He wasn't looking for his sarcophagus. He wanted to know where Herod was buried, and so he was looking for Herod's tomb. But these other people were not looking for these things. They just found them, and they turned out to be artifacts that actually show the Bible is actually accurate. The other example I was talking earlier is Lachish. Some of you, during lunch, we were talking about confirmation, biblical confirmation in the Old Testament. Someone asked me what was my favorite bit of evidence, and this is one of them. This whole episode here in the book of 2 Kings and also Isaiah 36 and 37. This is remarkable archaeological evidence for the reliability of the Old Testament. And 2 Kings, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. Then Hezekiah sent word to the king of Assyria at Lachish, however you want to say it. Lachish, as it turns out, is one of the main fortified cities, and during that time, in the Iron Age, during the time of Hezekiah, the king of Judah, that guarded the main road leading up to Jerusalem, located 30 miles northeast. So you may, at this point, be thinking, why are the Assyrians coming from the south? Why are they going to go why are they coming to Lachish? Why wouldn't they just go to Jerusalem first? Because isn't Assyria in the north, in Iraq? Yes, it is. But what, again, you may not be aware of is that several years before, the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom first in 722 BC under Tiglath-Pileser. And they settled, guess where the Assyrians settled? In Gaza, along the Gaza Strip. Today, what we call the Gaza Strip. That is all these Assyrian cities. They conquered the Philistine city-states located along the area. So there, the Assyrians already had military garrisons in the southern part of Israel at the time of King Hezekiah. And essentially, Hezekiah had made an alliance with some other Canaanite city-states and the Egyptians. And basically, they were telling the Assyrians, we're not going to pay you money anymore. So the Assyrians like, okay, well, we're going to then come and we're going to take it ourselves. And that's what this all came from. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. It's a broad summary statement. Then Hezekiah sent word to the king of Assyria at Lachish. So Lachish is 30 miles northeast. In 1929, a site called Tel el-Duwer was identified by William F. Albright, who you may recognize, William Foxwell Albright, the father of American biblical archaeology. They identified it positively as the ancient ruins of Lachish. And since that time, since 1929, all the evidence so far actually supports that this exactly is the case. Beginning in 1932, huge excavations were started by the British and continued so far. All the archaeological data support this idea that it is Lachish. So again, just show you on the map here where this is. There is Lachish. You see Gaza in the south, the Philistine city-states, and you have Jerusalem. So the Assyrians are already there in the south, and they're going to then come in and take Jerusalem. And they're going to approach their main fortified city of Lachish. Now, this is recorded in the Bible. This is recorded in the book of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah. What else does Isaiah prophesy? Who else does he talk about? About the Messiah, doesn't he? So this is a book that has historical connections to it. And can we trust the historicity, these stories? Can we trust these Bible stories? Is this just a bunch of made-up stories? No, you can actually go. You can go to Lachish. You can go to Jerusalem. You can go to Gaza. You can go to Beersheba. You can go to Beth-El. You can go to Shechem, Samaria. You can go to all these places. This is the Assyrian Empire. To show you how big it is. All the way into Iraq, into Iran, somewhat into Saudi Arabia a little bit, and then all the way up into northern Iraq, into Turkey, into Anatolia, down through the Syrian coast, all the way down through the Levant, Israel, Jordan, and then in the Sinai Peninsula, all the way down in Egypt. So they were a massive, massive superpower, and they exercised great control. This thing, well, stay on my ear. Sorry. I got small ears, and this little thing just keeps moving. So this is a massive, massive powerhouse of an empire. Now, we know Sennacherib existed. He's not just some made-up king. In fact, this is in Chicago. This is actually, I've led many, many trips here. Some of you, I don't know if anyone's ever taken my tour, but I lead tour groups. If you're ever in Chicago, maybe you guys ever want to set up a tour, I'll be glad to give your group a tour. It's now called the ISAC Museum. ISAC stands for the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures. But for 100 years, it was called the Oriental Institute. And this is the museum at the Oriental Institute. This is actually a panel, a gypsum limestone carved panel wall from a palace, an Assyrian palace, by the father of King Sennacherib. His father was named Sargon II. This is the palace of Dur-Sharrukin, or Khorsabad, located in northern Iraq. And there in the throne room is none other than Sennacherib himself with his courtesans. And so Sennacherib is a person that really existed. Not only do we have it in his palace walls, but also Sennacherib, when he came back to his city of Nineveh, after his campaigns into Israel, the Bible, of course, what he wanted to do as an Assyrian king is you want to conquer the capital city of the empire that you're fighting. What was the capital of Judah at the time? Jerusalem. Well, when he comes back on his large palace in Nineveh, Does he have on the palace walls that he conquered Jerusalem? No. What does he have? He has Lachish. Why doesn't he have Jerusalem? Because he didn't conquer Jerusalem. He had it surrounded. He besieged it, but Hezekiah tells us that the Lord struck down the army of the Assyrians, and they fled back to Assyria. So isn't it curious that this great and mighty king of Assyria does not have Jerusalem on his palace walls? He has Lachish. And it is written about all extensively in the Assyrian records as well as the Bible itself. We have found Nineveh. It's called Tel Kuyunjik, or Nabi Yunus, or the Mound of Jonah, the Tomb of Jonah. Interestingly, that's what the Muslims call it. There is a Muslim tradition, by the way, that Jonah is buried there at Nineveh. I don't know if that's true or not. I have not been able to verify that, but the Muslims actually call it Nebi Yunus, or the Tomb of Jonah. And so this is actual artist rendition of what it may have looked like in its glory day. The city itself was first studied by a French consul general at Mosul, Iraq in 1842 by the name of Paul-Émile Boda. And then in 1847 by the British diplomat Austin Henry Layard. He explored the ruins, and in 1849 he rediscovered the lost palace of Sennacherib. He found the actual palace of this Assyrian king that contained 71 rooms and giant colossal bas-reliefs. Layard also unearthed the famous library of Ashurbanipal containing 22,000 cuneiform clay tablets. He eventually sent all the material to the British Museum in London. Some of the other material went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And it was there at the basement of the British Museum with this huge library of cuneiform tablets that the British scholar George Smith worked for years translating these tablets and discovered the Epic of Gilgamesh in Tablet 11, called the Flood Tablet, that sounds almost identical to the flood story in the Old Testament. The site was later explored by Hormuzd Rassam and George Smith, who excavated. But here are a few slides showing us the siege and conquest of Lachish, depicted on the palace walls of Nineveh, showing you the Assyrian army as they laid siege to the Lachish. And all the while this is happening in Jerusalem, what is Hezekiah doing? What does the Bible say? Does anyone know the story? He's digging a water tunnel because he knows the Assyrians are on their way. And what are they going to do? They're going to poison the water. That's the first thing they're going to do. They're going to starve the city out. So what does he do? He dams up the Gihon Spring, and he has his workers dig down under the city of Jerusalem to bring the waters from the Gihon all the way underground so they can't be touched. Pretty smart. And he broadens the walls. And do we have evidence of that? Yes, all of it. We have evidence of the broad wall. We have evidence of Hezekiah's tunnel. Some of you have probably been in Hezekiah's tunnel. And the 1800s, the late 1800s, there was British explorers who actually discovered the inscription connecting, from the workers connecting the tunnel walls under the city of Jerusalem. That's now in the museum in Istanbul, Turkey. And so this was a violent battle, and the Assyrians were really brutal, and they beheaded people, they impaled people, they would stick their bodies on big staffs and, put them outside the city walls. So it's a pretty gory, bloody scene there. And you see there Sennacherib there overlooking the whole thing, and then they take off captives of Judea and other nations being taken off into Assyria. What are they doing? What are the Assyrians doing? Well, they're putting them into labor in quarries to build these giant Assyrian statues. And you see there, they're actually pulling these large stones that are going to end up turning into these lamassu, these large Assyrian winged bulls that are going to be in these Assyrian palaces. So Jewish captives actually helped build some of these Assyrian monuments. So really amazing. Well, here's Tel Lachish today. This is what it looks like today. If you go to visit Lachish today, this is the remains of the outer gatehouse, and then the ramp leading up to the outer gatehouse. The next slide is actually showing us what it would have looked like during the day of Hezekiah, during the day of the Assyrians. So this would have looked like. And, of course, on the top of that area, Israelites would have, shot down arrows, flaming arrows. They would have poured boiling oil on the Assyrians. I mean, it was brutal. I mean, a lot of the Assyrians died, but a lot of the Israelis died defending Lachish. But the Assyrians prevailed, and that's why it is on the palace walls there in Nineveh. We also have the Lachish letters. These are called ostraka. They didn't have paper back then, but they had pottery, and they would write on the pottery. Lachish, as it turns out, were destroyed twice. It was destroyed by the Assyrians in 701 BC, and then later by the Babylonians in 586, 587 BC. But essentially, this is a call from the Jewish commander at Lachish to Hezekiah. Come help us. We're being overrun. And then it never got out. But this is the Lachish letters. And remarkable. So this is, you can actually see it all fold out before our very eyes. And of course, we see in Jerusalem the siege preparations. When Hezekiah, 2 Chronicles tells us, saw that Sennacherib had come and intended to fight against Jerusalem, he planned with his officers and his mighty men to stop the water of the springs that were outside the city, and they helped him. And Edward Robinson, American seminary professor and geographer, discovered Hezekiah's tunnel, and there is the inscription there. Charles Warren also co-discovered it as well later. And it's written about here in 2 Chronicles, and there's the inscription called the Siloam Tunnel inscription. This is all recorded on the Sennacherib prism, or the Annals of King Sennacherib. This one is actually in Chicago. The other two, one is in the British Museum, and the other one is actually in Jerusalem. What does it actually say? Here's the translation on the bottom right. As for Hezekiah, I had him shut up like a caged bird in his royal city of Jerusalem. It does not say that he actually conquered Jerusalem. It just says he had him shut up like a bird in a cage. So we have some really amazing, remarkable evidence here that this happened. One of the things he also did, Isaiah 22, to go back to Isaiah, says, he removed the protection of Judah. You looked in that day to the armor of the house of the forest. You saw the damage to the city of David, that it was great, and you gathered together the waters of the lower pool. You numbered the houses of Jerusalem, and the houses you broke down to fortify the wall. You also made a reservoir between the two walls, so the city could have pool, the Siloam Tunnel, or the pool of Siloam. It's going to be expanded by Herod the Great. And by the way, they now have found the entire outline of the pool of Siloam during the days of Jesus. And when they are finished excavating it, you can actually go. It's the pilgrim road going up to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. But this is back in the days of Isaiah. He built this early pool of Siloam. You did not look to its maker, nor did you have respect for him who fashioned it long ago. So this is actually the exposed section of the broad wall, excavated in 1970s by Naaman Avigad in Jerusalem. It was discovered in the Jewish quarter. What the particular kind of architecture this is something called a casemate wall. So basically, like in our walls of our house, we'll have like 2x4s, timbers, studs, and then you have drywall on one side, drywall on the other side. Well, think of a larger version of that. Instead of drywall, and it's a much larger area, and it's a whole room. You can actually live in the wall itself. There's an outer part of the wall, then there's a room. You could put rocks in or dirt, or you could live in it, and that's what they were doing. These casemate walls had people living in the houses. And that's what that passage said. You broke down the houses, and you fortified the walls, and they broadened the walls of Jerusalem to withstand the Assyrian siege. 20 feet, 3 feet wide, and 213 feet long in the broad wall. Referred to both in Isaiah 22 and also in the book of Nehemiah. All the archaeological evidence supports Isaiah 22 that homes had to be destroyed to build the wall. By the way, as a little side note, to go back even further back in Jewish history, there was another woman who lived on the wall who helped Joshua and the Israelites. What was her name? Rahab. She lived along the walls. And guess what? German archaeologists discovered, guess what? A casemate wall on the outer walls of Jericho. Jericho also affirms the biblical record. So pretty awesome stuff here. But yeah, so these are remarkable. This is actually today, if you go in certain parts of the old city of Jerusalem, you can still see the broad wall of Hezekiah. So if you ever go back to Jerusalem and you see this broad wall, this is when King Hezekiah was preparing for the Assyrians to besiege Jerusalem in the 8th century BC. And this is what it would have looked like in its based on architectural and archaeological evidence. So what else? What other evidence do we have? Well, it just keeps going on and on. This is actually, it's really a little deceptive because it's not an actual, like, that looks like maybe a papyrus or something. This is actually from a lamassu. It's in between the legs of an Assyrian bull. This is just the cuneiform part. But this is called the bull inscription of Sennacherib. And it basically tells us that, which is exactly what 2 Kings 18 says. Exactly. I mean, in their own words, but essentially it corresponds to 2 Kings 18, which basically says that Hezekiah paid the Assyrian out of the treasure, the gold, and Jerusalem, to protect Israel. And that's exactly what he says. He paid this gold first to Tiglath-Pileser, but then, of course, Sennacherib came back to besiege Jerusalem, and that is when the Assyrians were defeated. In 2000, I think it was in 2003, maybe earlier than that, in the old city of Jerusalem, this seal from Hezekiah was discovered. And it literally says, belonging to Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah. So we have independent confirmation. This is the second one that we have, but there's more. Not only do we have the seal, the royal seal, the bulla of King Hezekiah, folks, we have the seal of the prophet Isaiah himself. The prophet Isaiah. This was found by Elliot Mazar. She passed away a couple of years ago, very sadly. Awesome archaeologist. She was the great niece of the great Israeli archaeologist Benjamin Mazar, who excavated Jerusalem in 1967, 1968. And she was his great niece. But she was digging in something called the Ophel. So what we think archaeologically in Jerusalem is that we generally know where the Temple Mount was, where Solomon's temple was, and we're pretty sure where we think the royal palace was. So there was something called the Milo, which is a stone, basically a supporting structure, supporting the stonework that supported the temple, the palace. So if the palace is destroyed, the thinking is, from the archaeologists, anything above that Milo was in the palace. So the Milo is in the Ophel. So all this debris archaeologically is down on the slopes, which means this all came from the area where the kings of Judah lived. And it was found, this is actually in the destruction, the 586 BC destruction by the Babylonians, because there was a burn layer, which means that it was sealed, which means that this predates the Babylonian destruction. It's earlier, and it shows us that there was this prophet, Isaiah Nevi, you know, the Nevi'im, which is that how you say it, brother? Which is prophets, right? Prophets. Isaiah the prophet, belonging to Isaiah the prophet. And so we do know that Isaiah, of course, prophesied the coming Jewish Messiah who's going to suffer. So this is amazing, remarkable evidence. Another photograph here with a drawing showing us the inscriptional evidence on this. So what about What about other evidence? Let me stop there, see if there's any questions so far about some of the evidences we've looked at for some of these Bible stories. Any evidence or any questions about the Sennacherib episode? One really cool thing about this, let me share this. I think I shared this at lunch. And this will be a great place to share this. I wish I had shared this. I did share this at the Messiah Conference last year in Pennsylvania. And here's the story. So in 1948, as you know, there's a story, and it's true, pretty true. There were two Bedouins they were around the Dead Sea area, and one of them actually threw a rock up into a cave and heard the sound of breaking pottery. He climbed up there. He's a young boy. He's pretty agile. He climbed up there and finds the top of a jar and puts his hand down inside of it, pulls out this huge leather scroll. It's the complete scroll of the prophet Isaiah. Okay? So the interesting thing that's not told when this story is told is that it looked like dirt on top of it. It was like almost, these things are like about this tall. I mean, if you're from the ground, they're about that tall. And the only thing showing was the top of the lid. It looks like a bowl upside down. And he reached down into the thing and pulled it up. But they're buried up to, it looked like dirt. It was actually bat droppings. It was 2,000 years of bat guano. So, seriously. Yeah. And so it actually helped preserve the Dead Sea Scrolls. 2,000 years of bat droppings. All the guys love that. This thing is, I'm just going to use this like this. Can y'all hear me okay? So essentially, they did not know. They know it had writing on it, and they thought, well, it's probably not worth a lot of money. So one of the guy, he had a friend of his who was, who was actually a cobbler in Jerusalem. It was a cobbler in Jerusalem. No, in Bethlehem, excuse me, not in Jerusalem, in Bethlehem. He was a cobbler is someone who makes shoes, of course. And to him, to this Bedouin, the fact that it was made out of leather and it was really old was more value than it had writing on it. So he was going to sell it to this guy for the leather and to tear it up and make shoes out of it. But word got around, well, maybe it might be worth something. Maybe somebody want to buy it, And so it ended up, this guy found out about it, and the guy who found out about it was a professor of archaeology at Tel Aviv University. His name was Eleazar Lipa-Sukenik. That was his name, Eleazar Lipa-Sukenik. Don't ask me how to spell it, but Eleazar Lipa, L-I-P-A, Sukenik, S-U-K, something like that. Anyway, he found out about it and said, if it's legitimate, then this may be from the Second Temple period when the Romans came in. Maybe this is some of the scrolls from the temple. We didn't know. He didn't know what it was. It was taken out of its archaeological context. So he did a little research and did some wheeling and dealing and had some money to work with not because there wasn't an Israel yet back then. But here's where it gets really amazing, okay? This is the complete scroll of the prophet Isaiah. The complete scroll of Isaiah. He sets up a meeting with the guy named Kando, who eventually acquires the scroll from the cobbler and ends up buying the scrolls from this dealer, this antiquities dealer in Bethlehem, which was occupied even back then by Palestinians and non-Jews. His friends were telling him, this is in 1948. Don't go into Bethlehem. You're going to put your life. They're going to kill you out there. No, this is important. I need to do this. This is important. This is really could be a very important thing. He ends up buying the scrolls for 100 pounds British sterling. And he bought it on the day the United Nations voted to declare Israel a nation. So Israel becomes a nation, and they come into the possession of the scroll of Isaiah. Is that not amazing? Only God can do something like that. Is that not amazing? There is not an accident, no accident of anything, but that especially is not an accident. Especially when you consider this archaeological evidence we looked at, the whole thing that preceded it was essentially a conversation that Hezekiah had with Ahaz, the father of Hezekiah. Ahaz had gotten word that the northern kingdom had made an alliance with the Syrians of Damascus. They basically had made this alliance with these not Assyrians, but Syrians, these basically Canaanite population. They were going to join together with them militarily. And remember now, these are the people of God. These are the 10 tribes, Ephraim, and all the 10 tribes of the north. And then you got the 2 tribes in the south, Judah and Benjamin, and Jerusalem. So Ahaz in Isaiah 7 starts out. It says that Ahaz gets word that the northern kingdom, Ephraim, has allied itself with Syria. And it says the hearts of himself and the hearts of the people of Jerusalem were terrified, and they were shaking like a leaf on a tree. And so he goes to Isaiah the prophet and says, hey, Isaiah, have you heard about this? You see what these people are going to do? They're going to come down here, and they're going to kill me. They're going to establish their own king.
they're like worried. They're wringing their hands. What are we going to do? We better do something about this. But hey, I heard that there's this really powerful nation to the north. Now I know they're bad guys. They're not the greatest guys in the world, but they got a big military. They got big jet airplanes, and they got great missiles. So we should pay them some money so they can protect us. Now that's the modern translation. But the Assyrians, and that was essentially what Ahaz was saying to Isaiah. And Isaiah says, whoa, wait a minute. No. Listen, it's not going to happen. The thing you're worried about is not going to happen, Ahaz. You're worried about these two nations. If you're the son of David, you're supposed to be trusting God. You're supposed to be trusting in God to protect Israel. You're not supposed to be trusting in some military power to save Israel. You're supposed to trust God to save Israel. And then he says this, something very interesting. Isaiah 7, just go read it. Isaiah says to Ahaz, you just ask God for a sign. You just ask him for a sign that I'm going to be with you, that my word is true. You ask me for a miracle. You want a comet? Give me a comet. You want some miraculous thing to happen on the earth or in the heavens? I'll give you whatever sign you want. I will give you a sign that I'm going to be with you. What does Ahaz do? I will not ask God I will not test the Lord. Oh, and then something amazing happens. Isaiah says, well, you test men, but you better not test God also. Therefore, God himself will give you a sign. If you're not going to keep the covenant, he will keep the covenant with you. Therefore, the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and you shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. So God says, I'm going to keep the covenant in spite of your unbelief. And then Isaiah says, if you will not believe, you surely shall not be established. That's literally what he says. If you will not trust and believe in me to save you, your line will not be established. So what does Ahaz do? He pays off the Assyrians. And yes, the Assyrians do come in, and they take out the northern kingdom, but they don't stop there. As Isaiah goes on to say in Isaiah chapter 8, they're going to come up and flood into Israel, flooding over the mighty river of the Euphrates and the Tigris, meaning Assyria. They're going to flood into Israel, and they're going to overflow up to the neck, and they're going to just about take you out. And that's exactly what happened with Sennacherib. And this is all in the book of Isaiah, which comes into the possession of Israel as a nation in 1948, which I think is quite amazing. So archaeologically, we have every reason to believe that the stories in the Bible are true and that we can trust and believe them, that they are accurate. So questions or comments on so far? If you raise your hand, and then we'll get a microphone to you and try to answer.
So if, let's say I take a relative to the museum in Chicago to show them that relief of Sennacherib's palace, right? How do I convince them that what I'm looking at are truly Judean slaves? You know what I mean? Like how do they know that?
So it's an inference on the history. But the ones that I showed earlier, the slaves, that's not in Chicago. That's actually in the British Museum. That's from Nineveh. So those are actually in the British Museum. The reason why we know some of them are Jewish is because of the Assyrian records. They took off Jewish captives. And so in the same panel that shows the destruction of Lachish, it's a bragging about them taking off. Those who they didn't kill, they took over into captivity. So, but we can't identify. Now, you could archaeologically, some people have looked at some of the way they're dressed and looked at some of their hairstyles, but there's no way to know with 100% absolute certainty that this is a Jew, that's a Jew, that's no way. We can infer some things from the text, but it's an inference based on the text of the Sennacherib prism, known as the Sennacherib, Annals of Sennacherib, and also in the biblical record as well, because the Bible does say that they were taken off into captivity. But we can't identify specifically that that is a Jewish person, if that makes sense. Yes.
So the scroll of Isaiah. So there had to have been other copies of it around to begin with, right? So what made this one special? Was it because it was the whole one?
Yes.
The other ones had been the scriptures that we have today were based upon several bits and pieces?
Yes, actually, it's a great question, actually, very insightful question. So the Isaiah scroll, and I didn't have time to develop this, but for many liberal scholars, many skeptical or critical scholars, I call them critical scholars, and I mean critical in this literary sense, they believe that the scrolls themselves, that the book of Isaiah, based on the literature, based on the construction, the literary structure of Isaiah, was not written by one single person, but was written by maybe 2 to 3 different people. None of them that we know can even know is Isaiah. Maybe there was an Isaiah, maybe there wasn't, but they're very highly skeptical as to whether or not there actually was an Isaiah. So, yes, it was based on fragments here, fragments there. But when they found the complete scroll of Isaiah, it was a complete literary unit with no breaks. In fact, there was a tradition called the Masoretes. The Masoretes were a group of scribes, Jewish scribes, and they had a scribal tradition that was very strict. And their purpose and the strictness of their traditions was to accurately preserve copies of the Torah, copies of the Old Testament, copies of the Word of God. And the Masoretic, one of the things they did, they had in their manuscripts, a scribe would sit down with, let's say, an original copy that maybe was written by Isaiah, and he would actually look and number each word, and there would be a number. Okay, count 1, 2, 3, right? Okay, 435 words on this manuscript. On the bottom, it's called a colophon. He writes 435. So if I copy it, it should have 435 words. So one word, they write it, one word, they write it. It's a very slow, methodical process. And so when they got to the end of the manuscript, on the second copy, when they came down, and if it did not add up to exactly, if there was one off, throw it away. Start all over again. That's how So the Masoretic tradition, this was a Masoretic text copied by the Masoretic scribes, indicating that these guys got it right. And the copy of the Isaiah that you have in your Bible is exactly, there was like, in fact, I have a quote. I'll give it to you after the next break. Actually, I'll pull it up because I have it. It's by Walter Kaiser, actually, Walter Kaiser Jr. He was talking about how basically, essentially, of all the thousands of verses, there are only 2 or 3 variations of spelling, but it's essentially the exact same text that we have, which indicates that the Masoretic tradition was a very accurate tradition of actually preserving scrolls. So at the end of the day, the Isaiah that you have is the Isaiah that and the archaeology backs it up. One author, yes. And a complete literary unit. There's no chapter, of course, in the scroll, there's no chapter and verse divisions, but also from a literary standpoint, there's no breaks. It's just one complete flow of thought. Now, there are different parts of the book of Isaiah that talk about, really, it's a miniature Bible. It really is amazing. And now today we have 66 chapters. It wasn't 60 chapters. That's just how the scribes, scholars arranged it. But as it turns out, it actually is sort of a miniature Bible because it predicts Jesus coming. It talks about his coming again and about his glorious reign and about Israel about God fulfilling all the covenants with Israel. And so it is a miniature Bible in one book. It is, I think, one of the most powerful books in the Old Testament. And it's the one book that will be a good dialogue for you guys, especially with your Jewish friends. And you can say, this is an amazing book. And the really problematic text is Isaiah 53, as you know, who they don't really like to look at. And you can ask them, well, who do you think this is talking about? Who is this suffering servant talking about? Maybe it's this person or that person, but Jesus is the only one who fits the bill. And interestingly, also I think I may show these slides afterwards. When Jesus stands up at the synagogue, and very early in his ministry, one of the first things he does after the baptism, he stands up, and as you know, as Jews, you can read from the Torah scroll or read from the scroll, and you can make a comment. And the first thing he does, Jesus opens up the scroll of Isaiah 61 to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, to proclaim freedom for those who are in bondage, and then to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord. Close the scroll. Today in your hearing, these words are fulfilled. Did he just say, did he say, isn't he the son of Joseph? Isn't this the son of Joseph? What does he mean by today is your, and what's amazing about that is that Jesus is claiming, remember what Isaiah talked about? I'm here. I'm now here. I am now here. I love that passage. But the other cool thing about that passage in Isaiah 61 is if you continue to read on and to bring in judgment. He doesn't read that verse. He stops at that verse because that's not why he came the first time. That's why he's coming again. So Jesus, as the Messiah, is claiming to fulfill the prophecies of the Old Testament, specifically Isaiah. And he makes that claim explicitly. There's so many layers to this. The other layer is with Isaiah, like a layers of an onion, is I got in this interesting conversation. I forgot who it was with. I've been blessed to be able to dialogue with some people that I really love and admire, like Dr. Eugene Merrill. I dug with him in Israel in 2014. I don't know if you know who this is. If you don't, it's okay. But he's well known in the evangelical community. Dr. John Walton teaches at Wheaton College. John Walton, I don't agree with John on a lot of things. He has a very interesting view of the conquest. He doesn't think it actually happened. Well, I gave a talk in Chicago 3 years ago, and John Walton came to my talk. And I was like, okay. So he probably, so I asked him what he thought. He was very polite and very nice, and, we had some good interaction. But it wasn't John. I forgot who it was with, but it was with a more liberal critical scholar. And essentially what he told me was that Isaiah did not speak for Israel. That was basically a minority report. This is what the king, it was royal propaganda. The actual religion of Israel was a mixture of Canaanite worship and Yahwehism. That was the real worship of Israel. I'm like, well, I don't deny that was happening. But that was the very reason why Isaiah said the judgment's coming. It's because you are worshiping Yahweh alongside Asherah and Baal and his other fertility gods. That's exactly the reason why Isaiah said that judgment of God's coming. And Jeremiah said the same thing. Jeremiah is even more explicit than Isaiah. Read Jeremiah. Man, he just lays these things. You bow down to them. You make them out of wood and stone, and you bow down to them. And God made everything. So I said to him, well, that actually affirms the text. The text actually said that's what was going on. And archaeologically, that's exactly what we find. So it's not a minority report. And, in fact, Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, I believe, is a vindication that Isaiah was giving the truth, that Isaiah was a true prophet of God, and that he predicted the one who by his stripes we are healed. So there's a lot of layers to Isaiah, and it's a rich book that you could dig into with your friends, your Jewish friends, and get into the archaeology. Any other quick questions, and then we'll take a quick break. Yes.
Okay. I was reading the book, Case for Christ, and one thing that was noted in that book is how quickly, and I think you were using the words early, attestation.
Yes, attestation.
Okay, and you mentioned to us the names of Ignatius, Polycarp, Josephus, Tacitus. So, do you have possibly an example to show how quickly these things were written? Because people were with Jesus and they wrote within the next 30 years. Because one example in that book that was noted was Alexander the Great. The first book written on him was 300 years later.
Oh, yeah.
And then the second book was written by two guys 600 years later.
That's right.
Can you expound on that?
Absolutely. So what he's talking about there, and I have a slide for it, obviously, there is actually a chart showing us some of the great people of history. We have Alexander the Great. We have Julius Caesar. We have Plato, Aristotle. And these guys were important figures in the history of the Western world, and they wrote major works that we still read today. But the manuscripts of those works are hundreds, sometimes a couple of thousand, 1,500 years after they lived. So how do we even know that? We don't know. And we don't. They were written not only 1,500 years after they lived, but there are only 400 or 500 sources. And so with the New Testament, we have manuscripts that date within the early part of the first century and the second century A.D., and internal evidences show that they were written within the period of the eyewitnesses. So, but as far as actual physical manuscripts, we don't. But and the claim is in the autographa, in the original writings of the Gospels, they are eyewitnesses. Because of probably their importance, they were spread around, and they probably got lost. And so we have very, very early copies. But the early copies, in the early copies, are preserved, the original writings. So we have very, very early source material. And in fact, even I would say Josephus would be considered, he's writing during the period of the eyewitnesses. And Tacitus is written a little bit later, but Josephus is certainly living within the time of Paul and Peter. They're still living in Jerusalem. The Apostle John lived later. He was exiled under Domitian, possibly exiled on the island of Patmos. So at the end of the day, we have maybe, at a very conservative range, we have 40 to 50 years after Jesus' resurrection, we have manuscripts, and a pretty liberal, or even, I guess, if you want to be more precise, or excuse me, a little bit more cautious, you would say 100 years after the time of Christ. But that's just being cautious. I think it's actually way earlier than that. It's 40 to 50 years after the resurrection, we have these manuscripts popping up. But with Dan Wallace, when he was talking about the early church fathers, and they're second century A.D., so they're in the hundreds A.D. Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 A.D., so 100 A.D. is about 30 years after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And there could still be people that saw Jesus alive during that time, and these early disciples, or these early apostles, like Polycarp, they're recording and they're quoting the New Testament. So when you start compiling all the manuscripts, and you have thousands of manuscripts, and the amount of manuscripts is just unbelievable. So we have a very strong manuscript tradition, and more manuscripts are coming to light this very day. Several years ago, there was a big brouhaha. I don't even know what language that's in, but that word is a funny word. So years ago in Dallas, when I was at the meeting with Dan Wallace, we were there with a bunch of other scholars and professors and things like that. And it was actually at the Josh McDowell headquarters. You know who Josh McDowell is? Josh McDowell is in Plano, Texas. And Dan Wallace was there. Professor at Baylor University was there. And we had all these other pretty large ministry leaders. I'll just tell you this because it's all public now. But one of the people that was a very wealthy Christian businessman who was buying manuscripts and buying things to help us to see if there are any new manuscripts. And these are all legitimately, not on the black market. They are all legitimate things that they could buy at auction. And it was the Green family who owned Hobby Lobby. So I actually got to meet him, Steve Green, the son of the founder of Hobby Lobby. So they bought some of these things. And one of the things they bought were these mummy masks. These are plaster masks that were used during the late Roman period in Egypt, which is the early church. And how they made them is they would actually use papyrus manuscripts. There were so many just papyrus manuscripts laying around, and they would glue them together to make these mummy masks in the late Roman Egypt. And what they discovered is that you could actually steam these things apart and pull these manuscripts out, and they were finding new manuscripts that had never been known before. And so I was there in Dallas. I got to see this up close. I got to hold one in my hand, actually. And so while we're there, Dan was there with his doctoral students at Dallas Seminary, and then also Baylor University was there, their classics professor, and they were actually looking at manuscripts as they were coming out of the mask. And one of the things that Dan said in the lecture that he gave was that it was, at the time, this was years ago, at the time, it was being researched, but they thought they may have had a first century fragment of Mark, first century. Turns out it's a false alarm. But that's not to say that some future discovery may come out to be a first century fragment of a gospel or one of the Pauline letters. But remember, Christianity and the case for faith is a cumulative case. It's not made or lost on one small piece of evidence. It's all of it together. And archaeology is based on probability. So it's not like, mathematical logic. It is you build a cumulative case. So we look at all the things together, and you take all of it together, not one piece at a time. You look at all of it together. And when you look at all of it together, a really compelling case can be made that the New Testament is giving us reliable historical information, and the Old Testament as well. So before we go for break, let me ask you, in our last session, because I have a huge amount of information archaeologically, what would you want to look at archaeologically? The Exodus, the conquest, Jesus, the New Testament, the book of Isaiah. I got a lot more on that. You tell me. You can think about it and tell me later, or you can tell me now. Anybody have any thoughts? Jericho, conquest? Let's do it. Okay. So after the break, we will do Jericho and the conquest. And I have pottery in the back from the site of Ai, which I helped excavate in 2014. So it's okay we take a quick restroom break? And then we will meet for our last session, and I'll be here as long as you need me to afterwards to answer questions. But I think I've got Ai on here. I know I got Ai, but I want to make sure I got Jericho. But there is amazing evidence of the conquest of Jericho and Ai conquered by Joshua and the Israelites. All right, Rabbi, you want to close in a little quick prayer, and we'll.
Of our time together, and we, Lord, and we ask you to refresh Ted. I'm sure that going through all this has got to be tiring too. So we pray, Lord God, that you will refresh and strengthen him too. In Yeshua's name, amen.
Amen.